Good afternoon. This is Dr. Ken Long at Command and General Staff College, Department of Logistics and Resource Operations, and I want to make a short presentation about the applied professional case study research method that we've been using for the last 5 years in our department for the Military Masters of Arts and Sciences, and the emerging best practices for how we do it and some of the background work as well. So the bottom line is this. We've noticed that there is a tension between a research orientation and a professional orientation when it comes to acquiring knowledge and making decisions based on evidence. So the problem occurs because professions are entrusted with a special responsibility to make difficult decisions based on professional standards, and that professional body of knowledge that these decisions rely on blends both a research and professional experience, and it's a body of knowledge that has been seasoned and socialized by non-researchers who have an orientation towards action. And this is specifically true in the military profession. And that's the specific professional that will guide the rest of this discussion. Our officers are assigned duties on the basis of their experience, judgment, education, and their reflection, which is manifested in their performance and judged by their peers and supervisors, who then comment on their potential. So they get put into positions where they're expected to make decisions within their authority on the basis of that judgment. When company grade officers, lieutenants and captains, who are direct action leaders, get promoted to the field grade rank of major, they go from being direct leaders to organizational leaders. And there, they encounter challenging problems that are complicated, sometimes complex, and even chaotic. And these problems demand more insight than is offered by their own direct experience. And so, a research orientation must be added to the mix. And that is where the tension between a research perspective and the world of professional practice comes into play. Now, by way of looking at history, you can see the research orientation that's embedded in what we call the Doctrine of Completed Staff Work, and this comes, legacy has it, from pre-World War II headquarters of General MacArthur. They had scaled up the size of the Army, had incorporated a lot of new officers, and they needed some directive guidance on how to do staff work that would free the commander to make important decisions without getting bogged down in incomplete staff work. And so the goal of staff work, as you can see, is that we provide the commanders completed staff work, in which we see more work for the staff member, but resulting in more freedom from the commander because it reduces his time commitment. He gets protected from incomplete, immature ideas, and the staff member who has really done the due diligence and has a good idea to sell is able to more easily find a market because he has a polished product. And the final test is, if you were the commander, would you be willing to sign the paper you've prepared and stake your professional reputation on its being right? And so here's the essential point about the profession and its relationship with research. Staff work is very much a practical research approach, but it does have to support particular important decisions. There is a bias towards action, and the standard is a professional reputation. You'll be judged by a commonly held, socialized standard of the profession. Now, this next slide on the left shows the staff study process and format that's found in our doctrine concerning how to solve problems. And you can see that it follows a pretty straightforward, rational, analytical model. Looks almost like a scientific method of problem solving, in which you have a clear statement of the problem, a summary of the recommendation you're going to make up front, and then just enough background to understand what's going on, a list of facts, assumptions, and possible solutions that start the inquiry, a definition of criteria, screening, evaluation, and weighting that will be used to shape and analyze and then choose between possible solutions. Then a period of analysis in which some solutions get screened out, other solutions that are still in the hunt get compared by advantages and disadvantages. The comparison is performed, the conclusion is reached, required coordination is listed, and it comes back to support the particular recommendation that's wanted. Now, this is an abbreviated form of research, and what's missing from this, as opposed to an academic, rigorous research process, is the role of the individual researcher and his biases and the protection against that kind of blind spot. It also places an emphasis on operation plans and operations orders, and that the solutions and recommendations we're looking at are going to favor things like simplicity, clarity, positivity, brevity. It will identify certain assumptions that are required, but only just enough to make a decision that just has to be good enough for the next period of time. And it incorporates timeliness and flexibility because the world changes. Well, this is a practical approach to information development or knowledge creation that really is opposed to the idea of conventional research from an academic sense, which seeks to create timeless knowledge. And you can see some of the common problems that can be found. Many of these have to do with the scoping or shaping assumptions that we make to limit a problem and conveying just enough information to support a decision on the basis of risk-reward. So if anything, this looks very much like a optimization trade-off problem that engineers would favor when it comes to making practical solutions, as opposed to a theoretical scientist. So this represents this professional, practical approach that has resulted over the centuries in creating the professional body of knowledge which guides the decision-making and vision and practices of our military. So let's do a little thought experiment and follow a newly assigned field grade officer as she encounters this problem. So she gets a new job on the basis of, as said before, her experiences, education, reflection, and judgment. And on the first day in her job, she gets 20 assignments. In the first 19, she handles in a professional manner because she feels it's within her competence, and she is able to solve these problems using that good staff study procedure that we saw before, straightforward. The 20th one, however, feels like she's beyond her scope, and she decides that she needs to do additional research. Now, suppose she took a graduate school class on research and there discovered just how important it was to remove the observer or researcher bias from the proceedings in order to not fall into the trap of the inherent biases that an individual can have. So we bend over backwards in research to establish objectivity and triangulation so that we can create some timeless and enduring knowledge that is unbiased quality research. And so she gets guided by a research mentor who's an expert in research and perhaps that research method and protocol. He may be an expert in that and knows the ins and outs and can guide her as she goes through that maybe the first time in her life. And then she meets an academic standard at the end of that exercise, and she's able, let's say, to solve her 20th task because she was using that as her project for the class. So now she comes back to work with a certification in hand that she can do research, and there she confronts a new problem. What should she do about the previous 19 completed tasks that she now realizes might have been infected with her unconscious personal and professional bias? She didn't even know that was a problem. She was just solving problems in the usual professional way. But now that she knows that her own opinions may be unconsciously limiting the solutions that were considered, what should she do? Does she have to go pull all 19 of those back and subject them all to a research process so that she can get unbiased information? Well, you can't run a profession on that basis. We are trading off the absolutism, let's say, of objective knowledge for the practical professional judgment that lets us get through a series of improving conditions as we iterate towards success. So the Army has a broader problem now. How should we reconcile and integrate and then leverage these two different orientations, the research orientation and the professional orientation? How do we get the best of both worlds? So if I said the Army's problem was how to reconcile, integrate, and leverage the research and professional orientation, My goal would be to define a method that meets both the research and professional standards, is aimed at making practical improvements in the professional domain, and which would be persuasive to chief decision makers who must rely on that research integration in order to make important decisions that affect lives and treasure. And so my proposal is the applied professional case study. So let's go a little deeper and see what I mean by that. This is a summary of that method. It comes from a qualitative research tradition where we try to make sense and meaning out of complexity that's not perhaps reducible to numbers. And a subset would be case studies. And when you read the literature, you realize there are many different styles of case study research. To say case study to a historian has a different implication than if you talk to a medical professional or an engineer or an educator. So each of those disciplines have ended up defining what is a appropriate case study for use inside that discipline. Now I'm going to describe this method as a professional case study, a subset of the case study, and suggest that the professional body of knowledge is a significant part of any ecosystem and must be accounted for because of the privileged place it has in society. That professional body of knowledge matters. Now I distinguish between two types: a theoretical professional case study and applied professional case study. A theoretical professional case study, in my view, takes as the object of research an effort to improve the concepts, models, practices, and principles of that professional body of knowledge. An applied professional case study, as defined in this methodology, is looking to improve the outcomes for the profession by applying that profession's best practices properly. The professional body of knowledge for the military is so complicated that most people don't know all of it. Many people don't know any of it. And so when you propose to apply a profession's best practices, there is a certain element of procedural research that has to be done. But the focus here would be to discover which of those theories or subsets really do apply, and then apply them in the manner in which they were designed. And that takes professional judgment. Now, this method is also informed by a couple of other traditions, including action research, which is simply a method to document the learning by doing that's going on in a self-directed community of practice. So community of practices regulate themselves all the time trying to solve problems. They may not be self-aware of that. They may not be documenting that process. Action research is a way to iterate towards success by bringing a research orientation to document those processes and decisions and hopefully improve as a result of the research artifacts that are generated and then analyzed from each iteration going forward. This method is also informed by mixed methods disciplines, in which you are essentially gathering the different kinds of data you need with an appropriate method that respects the necessary standards and norms of the particular methods that you're using, and then seeks to mix that data in a specific manner to meet a rigorous design that meets research standards. So both of those disciplines, action research and mixed methods, are related to the execution and the operation of this method. And finally, we're going to apply professional models, concepts, processes, norms, and values from that professional body of knowledge, because that's what it takes to be persuasive to chief decision makers. If an organization has a defined process for how it makes a type of a decision for a particular problem, and you propose to advise that chief decision maker, then you're obligated to account for and apply that practice, or have a very good reason why it shouldn't apply in this case, in which you're probably having to make two presentations. One, to convince that chief decision maker to use something other than the profession standard, and then to convince them the one you've chosen is excellent, and then the particular solution that it suggests. So applying these professional models, concepts, processes, norms, and values is an essential element of this particular method. At the end of the day, what we're looking for is triangulation to ensure that we have something like rigor and as much objectivity and professional judgment as we can bring to bear, so that we aren't becoming victim of the researcher's inherent bias. We are concerned about standards of quality according to a professional grade or a reasonable man approach, a reasonable professional standard as judged by that professional body of knowledge, and to see that the researcher, the officer, has done the due diligence that we would expect when working in that particular profession. So a little more about case studies. Why case studies? Well, they're useful as a way to conduct qualitative research. They're especially appropriate when your problem areas are human-centric, dynamic, and volatile. Those are exactly the kinds of things that are difficult to isolate a particular narrow hypothesis about which you can get objective information or knowledge created. And these situations quite often contain this rich, dynamic mix of stakeholders, interest variables, and information concepts. And it requires a deep understanding of context in order to make informed policy choices to convince a chief decision maker about what to do in this complex world. That's according to Cresswell and Yin. Hancock and Algazine and Gagnon observe that case studies are appropriately useful when you're trying to inform or persuade policymakers, and especially when you're working in contexts that are both rich and deep and concerned with complex human issues where I want to take informed action to improve a situation. And there is certainly a trade-off in favor of making an informed policy choice in a very strictly defined setting, a case study boundary, over the purpose of generating broad theoretical knowledge. So in that trade-off between objective timeless knowledge and making an immediate impact in an informed way, it's clearly the latter that case studies are well suited for. Case studies can look at how different kinds of knowledge and their different associated methods of gathering and analyzing and make sense of that information can be used to weave together a rich and deep understanding. That's where that synthesis and integration that is commonly found among military chief decision makers. And so that's why a case study is particularly useful and appropriate for problems in a profession, in this case inside a military profession. And so I've written a paper that talks and made some presentations about how we have been developing this particular method and using it in our military Master of Arts and Sciences over the last 5 years. I have a set of critical questions and decisions that should be made that can help the committee guide a case study design to make sure that you're getting the right elements of the professional body of knowledge in order to inform different solutions for a particular problem that are persuasive to a particular chief decision maker, and then identifying the stakeholders that would be involved in adjudicating whether or not it's actually any good. By answering each of the key points that those questions propose, then we can make a design, a research model for this MMAS case study and show that it is systematic and it's consistent and aligned in order to support their particular research design. And so the emerging method then, to summarize, would be the applied professional case study. It's research because it's designed, systematic, disciplined, multi-perspective, critical, and documented. It supports one of two purposes. It can either look to solve a particular problem, like a policy recommendation, or it can simply incorporate a research perspective to generate a very rich description of a situation. So research can be involved in both of those elements. So the two purposes it could be applied to, again, set the background by defining a rich description from which subsequent policy research could begin, so it establishes a baseline, or you could even go so far as to take that baseline and then recommend a policy by use of persuasion, reason, and evidence. So that's why it is a case study. It's a professional case study because we're concerned with these elements here. We might identify a chief decision maker, such as the Army Chief of Staff. We might decide for this particular problem that we need to conduct a capabilities-based assessment, which is a process the Army uses to make judgments about force management and force development, combat power creation choices. We might pick a model called, in this case, the .mil-PF domain that describes an analytical framework that can be used to systematically examine an issue from the lens of doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership, personnel, and facilities. So that doctrinal PF model is a way that we can be systematic and disciplined in multiple perspectives identified. We might pick the professional criteria of suitable, feasible, and acceptable to screen and then judge different policy choices that arise from our analysis. Suitable meaning, does it solve the problem that we described? Feasible, can it be achieved within a reasonable resource constraints? And then acceptable, does the list of stakeholders all agree that this is a better idea than the status quo, or are there significant objections? So is it acceptable to those who are affected by the policy choices? And then stakeholders might be members of the Army level staff or field commanders who have to implement this. And so as you go through the military profession, identifying these components here help you decide on a particular research design in a path through the literature and through the analysis that will result ultimately in a recommendation for action. And so this is an examination of an applied case study because we're trying to apply a process to get a specific answer. If we were going to do a theoretical professional case study, we might examine one of these elements here and say, you know, the criteria of suitable, feasible, acceptable, which is a professional standard, is incomplete or insufficient or outmoded. And we might do some research to make an argument that the professional body of knowledge itself might need some adjustment. But in our case, generally speaking, we're looking to solve particular problems, so we use an applied professional case study research method. And this simply restates, and I won't go back through that in detail, but again, we're in line with the qualitative research decision, but it does incorporate elements of the learning by doing of action research, the multiple iterations, the incorporation of some mixed method ideas to ensure that the case study brings in the persuasive evidence that the profession would expect to engage with when making a decision. And then it's going to apply the professional body of knowledge for a chief decision maker to make a decision. So there's that orientation towards action. And it's going to be concerned with these issues: triangulation, quality, professional grade standards, and then due diligence and level of effort. Now, when we take the particular 5-chapter master's thesis and we map this method to it, there are some certain things that you then expect to see in these typical chapters. So if chapter 1 is about an introduction that establishes the nature of the problem and why it's important and why we should do something about it, we have the officer construct what we call R1, which is the pre-research initial personal recommendation. We believe the officers come to our school with an intention to make an improvement to the Army in an area that they are familiar with and that they're passionate about and that they have some background about. So rather than isolate their research from their own experience, and they actually may be one of the most knowledgeable people in the Army about that, rather than deny that experience and reflection to the research, we decide to embrace it, but then account for it by asking them to do a detailed, transparent statement of their initial personal recommendation. We usually ask them, if you didn't have time to research but had to make a recommendation, what would you do and why? And from that statement, we're able to derive a whole list of assumptions and beliefs, the extent of their knowledge, their personal biases. And then the job of the committee and the researcher is to ensure that we are reading documents, conducting interviews, doing analysis, asking questions that will challenge each and every one of those assumptions during some point of their reading and their analysis. And so we embrace the R1, but we also start working on it. Later on, we're going to conduct, after we've done our literature review and defined our methodology, and they've conducted some analysis, they're going to come in with an R2 position. Let me jump ahead here. So if R1 is the pre-research personal recommendation, R2 is the position that has evolved as a consequence of answering the committee's questions by reading the directed material, conducting literature review and analysis, and coming up with some a new set of research-informed recommendations. And that's what we call R2. If we've done our job correctly, then we are never surprised when we see a much more detailed and nuanced and even contrary position between R2 and R1, that they started off at R1 and they have evolved through research to R2. Now, a lot of folks would then say, well, R2, I can take that into the commander and ask him to do something with my recommendation. But any good commander is going to say, before I make a decision, who's going to be affected by this recommendation, and what are their positions, and how does that inform your recommendations? And so we conduct a second round of analysis where we take the researcher, the officer's R2 updated position, and then we conduct a formal multi-perspective critical thinking stakeholder analysis where they adopt the roles and perspectives of these different stakeholders and look back through that lens towards their own recommendations for ways to improve it, critique it, veto it, override it, alter it in some way so that it would be acceptable to the stakeholders. And as a result of that analysis, that stakeholder analysis, they then develop the R3 position, which is an updated set of recommendations that are improved by that stakeholder lens. And that's what we identify as the recommendations to take forward to the chief decision maker. Now, because we have an interest in practical, feasible implementations of our planning, we use the Cotter model to inform our Chapter 5 recommendations, where we actually ask them to develop a campaign plan that includes timeframes, priorities, and phases, and research implications to develop an implementation plan that could be the basis for a complex program of action, because that's got to be negotiated and staffed through a large Army bureaucracy. And so the implementation plan really comes back to establishing that what we have is a feasible, suitable plan. We then list in Chapter 5 research questions that went beyond the scope of our initial case study that future researchers could then take on, and this is how we iterate towards success, and that's where we have a connection to the iterations of action research. We've had multi-year programs where different officers have picked up the ball and continued to run with it. And then we finish up with personal lessons learned as a result of this year-long engagement between the profession's body of knowledge, the committee, the researcher's own initial positions in this analysis, along with the rest of the academic year. And the personal lesson learned is where they can become reflective about their learning and become a better staff officer as they go forward. And this is what we would think of in action research terms as first-person action research. So if those are the outcomes, then we can come back to Chapters 1 and 2. So if Chapter 1 established the introduction and the importance and the boundaries of the case, Chapter 2 is the literature review that includes all of the summaries about the professionally relevant sources that will be used as making this persuasive argument. It will include a discussion of who the chief decision maker is and why, and what their perspectives are. The same with stakeholders. It'll give us an overview of the processes, models, and values of the professional body of knowledge that are going into the to the process element of this, and then all of the usual content areas that are required for literature review about a particular study. Chapter 3 then is a brief description of the methodology that talks about why the applied professional case study is being used and what it is, and it identifies the answers to the 15 design questions that were used in the shaping of this unique professional research process. And these 15 questions come from that method that we've defined, and we'll see here in a little bit. And so these elements in blue are how we take the components of this case study method and map it to the traditional 5 chapters that you would find in a standard military masters, and it allows us to tell the story and unfold. So as we evaluate this in terms of research, we say it's research because it incorporates systematic, rigorous, multidiscipline critical thinking and meets research standards for the gathering of data and analytical rigor. And we can see that it's that the officer is accounted for his bias in the path that he takes from R1 to R2 and to R3. And we're never surprised when at the end of this, in the reflections, the officer discovers just how much their initial positions really changed once they applied a systematic research process to it. Without reading these, we're discussing in great detail, and I could do that later with individuals when we do our design process early. These are the questions that we ask that help us shape out the different dimensions of this professional case study as it applies to the military. And these are appropriate for the kinds of problems and processes that we encounter when studying military problems. Just as a quick example, we have used analytical processes like structured staff studies to guide research, or components of Army doctrine. We've used a capabilities-based assessment model as a way to identify opportunities and gaps in our military capabilities. I've talked about these criteria. We have used at times the VUCA model to describe the world in which these solutions must operate, a world of volatility, uncertainty, chaos, and ambivalence. There are times when we're studying the logistics functions that the sustainment preparation of the operational environment is a model that we use to define the operational conditions for that solution. When we're looking at elements of education and training, we have used the ADDIE model, the Accountable Instruction System, Bloom's Taxonomy. These are all examples of recognized best practices that our profession would use. We have used the Army design methodology as a way to do problem finding and problem framing when we are encountering particularly wicked or unstructured problems. So these are all elements that can be chosen as a result of answering these design questions as part of this method. So it's not unusual to see our research designs displayed graphically. I'll just run through a couple examples here. Here's one where the officer had come up with a number of proposals for improving the curriculum that he had just gone through, and he wanted to apply a research process to it. So we identified these as hypotheses, and then we did a systematic view of the impact of that proposal on Army doctrine through the lens of the high-level Department of the Army staff, through the training and doctrine command who's responsible for updates to doctrine, and then through the lens of individual officers. And then by systematically going across and decomposing and analyzing each proposal, we could come up with insights about that proposal, and we might update it as a consequence of this analysis, and then define something like a priority for action. At the same time, we could take a look at all the doctrinal implications of each of those proposals and come up with a summary by lens. And when you do this horizontal and vertical analysis, when you come to the end, you are then able to conduct some thematic analysis to synthesize information about this bundle of proposals, and that would lead us to a recommendation for action. Now here's one in a practical way where a Norwegian engineer officer was looking for ways to improve his Army's capabilities in the future to meet NATO requirements. And he was going to examine a set of literature, in this case from the past, the present, and the future, in order to understand and then envision engineer requirements on the battlefield. And then he was going to take those insights and examine them for doctrinal, organizational, training and leadership, and education implications. And as a result of that, he would come up with a statement of requirements about what needed to be done for the future that could then be prioritized. This one simply talks about the action research model, so that when we are going to do multiple iterations about a problem area that is not well defined, in many cases we go out, find some literature, and then have to reframe the problem when we discover what's already done or not done about it, or we find assumptions that have been invalidated. And so you get this iterative approach to progressing through a body of knowledge that is characteristic of the action research model, and that's why it's strongly connected. Now sometimes these processes become almost artistic in nature. We had an officer that was looking to assess how the Army might try to implement mission command. And so that research map looked like, first, a review of the history of Army leadership doctrine, and how it came to pass that the Army chose to adopt the mission command philosophy, and then defined it as in terms of what is it, why do we need it, how do we plan to get there, and what are we doing about it, the Army's plan to do that. And so that's the Army's intention, and then we could then go out and find documents and conduct interviews to see what is the Army actually doing about it. So we have a plan for action, but then what are we doing? And then we could look at 5 different lenses, which come from 5 different leadership models, and see that according to these different leadership models, how well is the Army converting intention into practice? And we could analyze these actions through each of these lenses, and as a result, come to some kind of summary or integration about how well the Army is engaging in the world of theory and the world of practice. And then we might come to a conclusion about what could we do better about implementing mission command. And so this is an example of a typical visual research map that can be used in this particular method. The last one I'll show you is that we were trying to work with an unstructured problem, which was how to define an approach to systematically and strategically hedging the Army's budgets against future uncertainty. And so the officer built a descriptive model that would take a sampling of different indicators of future performance in 4 different variables that would affect budgets, and then integrated that into some decisions that could affect the size of budgets. And then he built a descriptive model and then a predictive model about how changes in the world might affect our budgets and then ultimately affect the strategic posture that senior leaders would adopt. And then that would become guidance to the Department of Defense on how to allocate money in line with the changing vision. What we didn't want to do was become surprised by a change in strategic vision. Like if we were no longer going to become a global hegemon and simply become a regional power, we should no longer start spending money on fast sea ships and instead spend money on local area defense along our borders. And so we don't want to get stuck in the wrong strategic vision for too long. And the idea was that if we could monitor certain key indicators in our economy and political system, that we could be better in tune with an evolving strategic strategy. So we can go from extremely detailed and fine-tuned ideas about engineer capabilities or dealing with philosophies and doctrines, even to the point of strategic level engagement with this model, and we find it to be very, very effective. So I want to come back finally just to say, when it comes time to brief this particular model, we take it as given that the chapters 1, 2, and 3 have been well understood by the committee, and what we do is we focus mostly on chapters 4 and 5 in the final defense. We work hard on the initial proposal review for chapters 1, 2, and 3, but in the final defense, we're giving an officer an opportunity to make a persuasive case that for the problem they defined, that they have a suitable, feasible, acceptable set of solutions. And we pitch this as a practice or rehearsal for their briefing to the chief decision maker, and now they get a chance to work on their oral presentation skills as well as their written presentation skills. And by focusing on chapters 4 and 5, give them a chance to act like professional staff officers, trying to be persuasive to the chief decision maker. So taken together, what we think we have here, if we go back to the to our goal statement, we think what we have here is we found a way that we can reconcile both the professional body of knowledge with a research approach that respects rigor, and that we can combine and make the best of both possible worlds. We find that officers who can go through this process, when they go back to their organization, now have the skills to be able to diagnose the problems as they come in, and then apply the appropriate level of research rigor that is appropriate for that degree of complexity, and that they can continue to use their professional judgment where it's warranted, and that they can apply research in a professional manner, in an academic manner that would give them reasons to have confidence in their final solutions, but always in service to a profession's body of knowledge and the chief decision makers that have the mission to make differences in the world. So that's the background behind the Applied Professional Case Study. I really appreciate you hanging in there, and I look forward to continuing to refine this and updating it as we go. This is all my contact information. If you'd like to discuss or have any questions, I'm certainly happy to talk about this until your ears fall off. So thanks for hanging in there. Have a good day.